We've been talking a lot last unit of this course about humans and how we make place meaningful and about homelands and topics like that. We're now shifting gears to talking about humans as we travel to different places and spaces. And we're going to start with one of the paramount ways in which human beings do that, which is what I'm broadly calling nature-based tourism, but really just anytime people travel to a place where their stated intention, where their main purpose is to see non-human nature. And so that's where we're going today. And although that'll be part of the topic, perhaps larger part of the topic really will be a bigger discussion of protected lands, protected areas, which are very important. They're important to us as Alaskans, of course. 88% of Alaska is some form of public land. Doesn't all mean protected areas, but there is a lot of protected area space in Alaska. And close to one third of the nation's wilderness areas, which is actually a specific legal designation. I don't just mean like forests, but like specifically wilderness areas. One third of that is in Alaska. So we're very much a protected area heavy state. We're also a nature-based tourism heavy state. That's a major source of our revenue. And it's one that has a lot of effects. One could argue both positive and perhaps more negative on the state. And so we will talk all about that, a lot of the more Alaska specific materials in the next lecture, but this week I kind of want to give a foundation of talking about protected lands and nature-based tourism around the world. This is just a meme to make you laugh. So either you laughed or you didn't. Okay, laughing completed. All right, so let's start by talking more generally about protected areas. And I so geniusly titled this slide, Protected Areas, They Are a Thing. And so I'm going to set my timer because I keep making these videos way too long, and I'm sure everybody's getting very tired of it. So I'm going to set this timer to remind myself when to at least pause the video. Okay, there it goes. All right, well, first of all, if you look at a map of protected areas in the country, like this one, although this is from 2004, so it's a bit outdated, but the general trends would still be the same. You'll notice again that Alaska has one of the highest percentages of protected areas. Technically, Nevada has higher, so at 84.5. So I guess technically we're second place, but we have a lot of protected areas, but more generally, the Western United States does. That partly reflects the history of protected areas and how they started in the US, which we'll get to in a bit. But the short answer is settler colonialism kind of moved to a certain point, right? So sort of broadly, the United States kind of moved to a certain point and then didn't start kind of really seriously thinking about protected areas until it got to right around this area, which is then where we started making protected wilderness areas, national parks, all sorts of things. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but we'll talk more about the history in a moment. By the way, this is a map of Alaska, and as you might guess from these various things, not only is there a lot of protected land in Alaska, but it really varies in terms of what we mean by that. You have places that are U.S. Forest Service, like the Tongass Forest, where usually it's activities are limited to some camping and logging and very specific kinds of logging. And then you have areas that are national parks that are more for visitation. And then you have areas like Bureau of Land Management, which, as you can imagine from the fact that a lot of these are areas on the North Slope, oftentimes Bureau of Land Management, although they're technically protected areas and they do definitely have protections, there can be a lot of sort of extractive activities on them, like actual oil drilling. And so lots of variety in what we mean by a protected area. And that's part of what this map is there to kind of show you. But humans have been doing kind of protected areas since long before we had these legally designated things we call national parks or national forests or Bureau of Land Management lands. Indeed, protected areas go back centuries, if not millennia, for human beings. I've got just 3 examples here, although we could share many others. The first one has to do with the Hawaiian monarchy. Before colonialism, of course, Hawaii was originally a series of chiefdoms on different islands that eventually coalesced into what we would call a complex chiefdom, or really a monarchy, where you had sort of a chief of all chiefs, a king or a queen, as it was translated into English, that was over the entire island chain. And I believe this was true on individual islands as well as at the monarch level, but monarchs generally could declare certain areas as mana, which that term often gets translated into English as kind of like power, which is why then it works its way into like certain RPGs as like, mana as like a magical quantity. But anyways, the term mana, though, it's a really hard to translate word. It's actually found in many of the Polynesian languages, not only Hawaiian, various forms of it, like mana or manu. So you had mana, and the idea that the Hawaiian monarch had mana and therefore a certain kind of relational power or relational authority might be a good way of putting it, where you needed to listen to them and respect them and have certain protocols of respect. But then there was also the idea of tapu or taboo. The origin of our English word taboo, and just like in English, the idea is sort of something forbidden. Within Hawaii and other Polynesian islands, there was sometimes the idea that chiefs could designate certain areas as tapu or taboo, where you were not supposed to hunt or fish in that area. And so the result of that was that sometimes you had what we might call de facto marine protected areas, right? Nowadays, if you have a chunk of the Hawaiian coastline that you say nobody fishes in there, we would call that a marine protected area. And the effect of that is that you have a place where you have a source population, by which I mean the fish can breed without being fished there, without being caught. And it can be a source of sort of strength of building up your population that can then just help distribute to other places if their populations are low. So you have a de facto nature preserve, even though it was embedded not in a sort of federal US system of government, but instead in this sort of traditional monarchy and this religious conceptualization of taboo. You could, speaking of religions leading to protected areas, we could also talk about Buddhist monasteries, certainly to this day, but also historically. In many parts of Southeast Asia, Buddhist monasteries would have a certain amount of the area around it where people didn't hunt or where they didn't cut down trees. And so what you essentially had around monasteries and temples was, again, de facto protected areas, basically areas where nature had a certain protection from the usual human activities. Another example, which is why I have our terrible, evil poacher Robin Hood here. I'm just kidding, of course. First of all, this is a fox. I don't think he's poaching anything other than perhaps a mouse or something when he's hungry. But anyways, our famous story of Robin Hood, that's of course very popular and been featured in numerous movies and TV shows and everything, originally comes from the legend of Robin Locksley, who allegedly, whether he was historic or not, allegedly poached from the king's lands. So the monarchs in Britain at the time kind of, let's say 800 years ago, would designate huge amounts of the territory of the forest as like, oh, this is royal forest where we get to go hunting, we being the monarchs and the nobles. And then, folks would be sort of poor in the sense that, well, they were poor, period, but then also didn't have access to where they would want to hunt, right, to be able to put food on the table since they were poor. And so Robin of Locksley, right, was a poacher who went against the king's prohibitions on hunting. And so that's kind of the legend grew of somebody stealing from the rich, but what he was stealing from the rich originally was wildlife. So anyways, crown lands become, in Britain and other European countries, but especially Britain, crown land becomes the foundation for what we think of as public land in the United States, which is why by the time you have like the early US government, they think of certain lands as like, oh, if it's not somebody else's land explicitly, it's public land, right? Crown land becomes just sort of public land in the American system of government. The idea that the government sort of de facto owns the land unless it's been parceled out otherwise. So anyways, so protected areas in the sense of areas that we protect have been around a very long time. And yet the idea of protected areas as we currently think of them, something like this, something with a sign, something with a park service ranger, something like that, something with people with written laws, and most especially a legally designated area where the idea is to protect non-human entities primarily, and often not so we can hunt them or something, but just to protect them. That's a relatively new behavior, and that's a pretty fascinating behavior. So the idea of protecting large amounts of space for non-human nature, and that's overtly the reason why, not so the royals have somewhere to hunt, not so that for religious reasons, but just we are putting down a label on this space and calling it protected for nature, relatively new. Last couple of centuries, really. And it's a concept that has huge effects on all of our lives and a huge effect on how tourism is done, because one of the main forms of tourism in the world is nature-based tourism, and it often goes to these protected areas. So there's this idea of we're going to go halfway around the world, or maybe just the next state over, to sort of consume nature, not in a consumptive sense, but to go see nature, to see something amazing. Now, when we talk about protected areas, first of all, I want to emphasize I'm generally in favor of the idea of protected areas for sure. I'm only emphasize that because there will be some critiques coming down the road of how we sometimes do protected areas. But the overall idea, I think, is a really good one, and clearly there's a need. About half of the habitable land in the world, about half the land that we could use, we do use, and most of that, the vast majority of that, we use to grow our food. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I'm saying that from a wildlife conservation perspective, you can see how there's portions of the land where certain wildlife populations might be in trouble, and we know that. And so the idea of protected areas to make sure that certain populations maintain well, obviously makes a great deal of sense. I'm also somebody that just on a practical level really enjoys protected areas. I go hike in my local wildlife refuge that's basically next door to me in Soldotna all the time. And so I think there's a clear need for protected areas, and most of us agree with that idea. I think there's a lot of promise with protected areas, that they can do a lot of amazing things, as the Lukens reading this week suggested, right? People were using that area for all sorts of things other than just conserving wildlife, right? They were going there to feel something emotionally, to physically benefit, to heal themselves. So I think there's a lot of promise with protected areas. There's also some potential pitfalls and problems with them, including are people allowed to live in those spaces, including indigenous peoples? And so we're going to talk about some of that complexity here, because it is really complicated and sometimes a very problematic past. So that's where we're going. A little bit about protected areas. This is from the IUCN. If you don't know IUCN, it's a really famous, what we'd call an NGO, or non-governmental organization. They're kind of a group of scientists that map how things are going for the world in terms of species extinctions and also protected areas. And they define protected areas as a clearly defined geographic space, recognized, dedicated, and managed through legal or other effective means to achieve long-term conservation of nature. The fact that they're saying legal or other effective means, from a discourse perspective, they're sort of saying basically legal is the most effective means, but there might be other ways. Now, that might seem non-controversial, but consider that for most of human history, we protected areas through things like religious taboos or sacred sites. And suddenly you see that it's a little controversial to say that, you know, the main way that we protect areas is through legal means, but that is indeed how it's defined. And that's definitely the dominant discourse, is that we need some kind of legal regulatory mechanism to protect nature, which in some cases is clearly true. I think we have a variety of natural spaces in the country that would have been really, really messed up during the gold rushes or during hotel booms of the early 20th century, if not for protected areas. So I see the logic of needing legal protections. I just wanted to flag and show how even seemingly neutral definitions in the tourism world or in the environmental world can have sort of implications, can have implied worldviews attached to them. In this case, the idea of needing a formal government legally designating a space, not maybe traditional ways of protecting a space. You can see there's kind of a ranking they do for protected spaces. They might say it's not a ranking, it's just 6 different categories, but it's interesting that the one that's up here is the strictest one, and the one down here is arguably the least strict one. And the least strict one is one where they conserve ecosystems together with cultural values and natural resource management. Generally large, mainly in a natural condition. So there's this idea throughout, you'll see it a few different places where they talk about a natural condition, natural or near natural areas, right? So this idea of sort of natural space that then human beings, the more we're involved, the more you go down the line of these categories, the more humans are involved, the less natural it is. And so that's a good example of what we sometimes call human nature dualism. And human nature dualism, I talk about it a lot in my classes, and it's easy to think that I hate the idea, not necessarily. Sometimes that line of thinking makes sense in certain contexts. Nobody wants sort of nuclear waste in the middle of their, area where they go to hunt caribou or something like that. So it makes sense sometimes to think in those ways of a dualism. And it's also a natural way to think. Lots of cultures, not just Western ones, have ideas of nature and human. Um, but it is interesting, right, that there's this implication here that the more humans are involved, the less natural it is. That structures a lot of how we think about protected areas, I think, for both good and bad. This was, I put this in, but I already did the caveat. This shows sort of the rates to which different categories of life are endangered. Some of them we don't have very good data on. Some of them we have great data on, like mammals and birds. And as you can see, right, mammals are about a quarter of them are endangered. That's not a great place to be. So once again, I am generally pro protected areas as a concept. The question is always, how do we do that? So that's going to be part of what this lecture is on, is talking a little bit about where they come from, how we do it, why we do it the way we do, and then how it relates to tourism.